Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Nar Initiative session on Housing Assessments 101. I'm Danya Ramori, the director of the Wallace Stegner Center Environmental Dispute Resolution Program at the University of Utah and the founder of the Gateway and Natural Amenity Region, or Nar Initiative. We're very excited to be joined today by Wendy Sullivan, who's from WSC Consulting. Wendy has done a lot of work on housing-related issues in NAR communities, and we are grateful that she's joining us today to share her wisdom. Before we transition to Wendy, we just want to say a little bit about the NAR Initiative and our webinar series. For anybody who is new to the NAR Initiative, NAR, GNAR, stands for Gateway and Natural Amenity Region. And the mission of the NAR Initiative is to help Western Gateway and Natural Amenity regions and the communities in them thrive and enhance the things that make them special. We try to do so through catalyzing and supporting research, education, and technical assistance programs. And we are very thankful to Utah State University Extension and the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism at Utah State for supporting the NAR Initiative. You can learn more about us on our website, which I'll put that link into the chat in case you don't already have it. If you haven't already done so, we highly encourage you to join our community and to learn more about what we're doing. And you can do that by signing up for our email list and putting that link in the chat as well. This webinar is the first in our series on how to shred gnarly challenges, tools and techniques, and resources to help address epic housing challenges. You can learn more about our webinar series on the webinar page. That link is now in the chat as well. And we know from our research that housing is a really major issue and often an acute issue for many communities in Gateway and Natural Amenity regions, as well as other communities throughout the West. So our hope in launching this series is really to provide some how-tos and some actionable approaches that you can all use in addressing your housing concerns in your communities and regions. We want to thank our sponsors and the many partners who are making this webinar series possible. We particularly want to thank the Wallace Stegner Center at the University of Utah and Granicus for their financial support, as well as the American Planning Association Utah chapter, which is providing AICP continuing education credits for this and the other webinars in this series. If you want to sign up for credits, this link should help you out with that also in the chat. We're always looking for more partners and more sponsors. If you're interested in supporting us and you want to contribute to our work, you can just let us know, send us a note sometime. You can also donate or encourage others to donate, and we have a donate now option, which I am putting in the chat. All right, one final announcement before we jump in. The NAR Initiative just launched our Gnarly blog, which is intended to be a space for anyone who is interested in Gateway and Natural Amenity regions to share their lessons learned, their wisdom, and their ideas with each other. And thanks to Liz, I think I was sending some chats only to the panelists, so hopefully she's got all those going to the whole group. So we just launched the Gnarly blog as a place where you can all share your wisdom with each other, and we'll be sharing some wisdom with you. So we encourage you to check that out and to consider potentially writing a blog to let us know, to share your wisdom with each other. And we're also interested in doing video blogs, podcasts, and other ways of sharing your wisdom, your lessons learned, whether you're a assistance provider for NAR communities or you're somebody in a NAR community. All right, let's jump into this webinar. So what to expect from today's session? First off, just know that this session is being recorded, and this recording will be available on our website after today, as are all of our past webinars. As anybody who has participated in our prior webinars knows, this won't be your traditional webinar. We really want to keep you engaging and learn a lot from you as we go through and learn from Wendy today. So we're going to engage you in a few different ways. We will have you submit any questions you have for Wendy via the Q&A function. You should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you want to send questions to Wendy for her to address at the end of today, please use that Q&A function. That way they don't get lost in the chat. And we're going to use the chat function. You should see a chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you don't already have your chat open. We're going to use that function to get you to share your thoughts, ideas, experiences, and observations throughout today. We're going to throw you a few questions for you to respond to via chat. And then we also just encourage you to make observations or share your thoughts via chat throughout the presentation. Just a note that we are considering some of the information we collect from today as soft research data. It helps us understand what's going on in our communities throughout the West. And your participation and sharing via the chat is informed consent, meaning you know that we are using this as soft research data. If you have any concerns about that, please just let us know. So like I said, we're going to engage you through the chat, and to help us get to know who's here on the webinar and also to get you engaging, we're going to do some sharing via the chat to start off. First off, I encourage you just to make sure that your chats are going to all panelists and attendees. So make sure that that's how it's set up in your chat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you all a prompt, and then I'm going to ask you to type your responses into chat, but try not to hit enter until I ask you to. And that way we have a little chance for everybody to type before we see all the responses and you don't get distracted by what's in the chat. So the first prompt, again, via chat, that I'm hoping you will all respond to is, what is your name and organization? Because we can't actually, you don't all get to put your organization in your name in Zoom. So we want to have a chance for you to introduce yourselves. So again, type into the chat your name and organization. And I gave you an example of mine, Danya Amori from the U of U EDR program. So take a moment, type that into chat, but don't hit enter till I ask you to. All right, people may need a little bit longer to type, but please enter your responses now if you've already had a chance to type it in. And then once you've had a chance to enter yours, take a moment and look at everybody who's on this webinar. I always think it's so fun to see who's all calling in. Looks like we've got people from all over the West and elsewhere. Really awesome. Please keep those coming in. No hurry. While maybe a few people are typing their responses in, I want the rest of you to type your response to this next question. And again, don't hit enter till I ask you to. So the next prompt is, how would you describe the housing situation in your community or region currently? And I'm going to encourage you to include the name of your community in your response, because again, that won't automatically show up. So take a moment, type your response in for that chat, but don't hit enter till I ask you to. All right, when you're ready, hit enter. If you need more time, take it. Again, the question is, how is the situation of housing in your community currently? And again, please include your community name or region as you enter your responses. Once you've had a chance to enter yours, you can take a moment and look through what others are saying. And just note, in our summary from this webinar, we will include some of these responses. We'll anonymize them. We won't include people's names. But if you don't have a chance now to look through all of this, you'll have a chance later in the summary. And thank you all for sharing. This is really helpful for us to see and to better understand what's going on in your communities. So again, I'm going to give it just a little more time for those to come in, and I encourage you to take a moment and look through the chat. All right, we have just 2 more questions for you to start things off. My next question, I'll wait a moment before I put it in the chat. My next question is, what would you say is the average price? And we're just asking for your knowledge about this based on whatever you know. What would you say is the average price for a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house in your community or region right now? So that next question's in the chat. And again, please include your community or region in your response. It's okay if you're guessing. It's okay if you don't know. We're just curious to get a general sense of what's going on in your communities. Seeing some responses come in, so go ahead and enter it when you're ready. And we'll give a moment for those to come in. And I encourage you just to take a moment and look through what everybody's saying. I know last I looked a few weeks ago, my hometown, Sandpoint, Idaho, was about $600,000 for anything I could find that was 3-bedroom, 2-bath. It's a lot of money for a rural community. I'm saying that's not unfamiliar for a lot of you. Give just a little more time for a few more responses to come in. Again, please include your community in your response if you think to. All right, so one final question before we start to pass it over to Wendy. I'm really interested to hear from you all. What do you think is the average per capita, per person income of people employed in your community or region right now? And again, I know you might be guessing, but we're really interested in your thoughts on this. And again, please include your community name or your region name in your response. Average per capita income. And I did a little research on Sandpoint, and what Google tells me is $20,000, which again might not be too unfamiliar for some of your communities. Just keep those coming in. Thank you all for sharing. And take a moment and look through what others are saying. All right, as a few more responses come in, again, just keep those coming in. We're going to pass it over to Wendy here in a moment. The next 50 minutes are going to be an interactive presentation and question and answer with Wendy Sullivan. And then we're going to try something new today. We want to give you all a chance to talk to each other, which we can't do on this webinar platform. So what we're going to do at 3 o'clock for anybody who's interested in continuing to talk about these topics more and get to really talk with other people in communities like yours, we're actually going to migrate over to a new Zoom link, which is a Zoom meeting. And we'll actually be able to put you into breakout groups to really talk to each other. So at 3 o'clock, we'll migrate over for anybody who wants to stay with us. We hope most of you will. And then we'll have a half an hour of time for peer-to-peer interaction, sharing, and really working through some of the things you're learning today from this webinar with Wendy. So know that that's coming. Don't worry about that until 3 o'clock. We'll set you up for that if you want to move over with us at 3 o'clock. Just a reminder, again, keep your comments, observations coming in via chat. If you have any questions for the presenter, please use the Q&A function to submit those, otherwise they get lost in the chat. So you can just use the Q&A as we're going through the webinar to submit any questions for Wendy. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Wendy Sullivan. Wendy, thanks again for joining us today to share your wisdom. You with us, Wendy? All right, there you are. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great. Great. Well, we have a big list here today. I see that. And, I'm kind of looking at everyone who's on the line, which is great because actually just a little bit about me. I've been doing housing work in communities, primarily high amenity mountain resort community areas for at least 20 years. Most of our work has been Colorado and West. So Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and California are kind of the primary areas. I'm looking forward today to sharing with you, once I share my screen, a presentation on housing needs assessments, basically what to look for, what they should contain, and how you can use them. So let me get this going. Great. And so today, basically, I'm going to be covering what information a housing needs assessment can and should provide for your community, why the information is important, and how to use it. Obviously, from the housing issues that you guys have been showing me, it seems that all of you have recognized housing is a problem in your community. I know COVID has really, in everywhere that we work, has really pretty much escalated trends that had already been happening, but basically just made them happen at 10 times the fold that they had been over the past several years. So in essence, a housing needs assessment should provide a holistic view of community and housing markets to determine local resident and employee housing needs across the entire income spectrum, from extremely low income through market rate. This is how I'm defining a housing needs assessment for today's discussion. Granted, some studies may focus just on the very low end of income. We primarily do housing needs assessments that focus on full community needs, from low income through high income and everyone in between. And so this, in essence, is what we typically expect to see at the end of a housing needs assessment. So what this bridge here is representing is what we call a spectrum of housing needs. And so it shows at the very far left end, kind of where your very low income community is that needs supportive housing, deeply subsidized rentals. And as you move over to the right, to the green side, you start moving into people where you need market rate rentals, opportunities for entry-level home ownership to come in kind of around the middle incomes, opportunities to move up in housing as families grow, and higher end housing for your higher end and larger families. And then as people age and downsize, also the ability for people to move into smaller units again for lower maintenance, thereby freeing up these larger homes. This in general is sort of what we identify as what communities should have in their town for people to be able to live their life from beginning to end. In doing a housing needs assessment, typically what you do is you look at where the current market is providing rental housing, where your current housing market is providing ownership housing, and where your primary locals and residents can afford housing and where the gaps are. And then here, your core housing target is identifying those primary income levels and parts of housing that you need to then address to try to get more in your community because the market just isn't able to provide it. So this is kind of the final outcome for most needs assessments. So I just want to go through a few definitions here because this will be coming up repeatedly throughout the discussion. But affordable housing, the basic definition of affordable housing, despite its connotation in some communities as being something other than generic, is housing is affordable if the monthly housing payment, which would be rent or mortgage plus utilities, is less than 30% of gross household income. Regardless of your income level, regardless if you're low income or high income, as long as you're paying less than 30% of your income for your housing payment, then it is deemed affordable. Area median income, which are some of the categories that you saw in the prior spectrum that I showed. This is basically an industry standard that's defined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development every year for every county in the US. And it's used to define income limits for community housing units produced at various levels of affordability. These are the standards that are used, for example, if you're going to bring in some affordable rentals to your community to determine whether people can income qualify for those units. The housing program or strategy, this is something that you would, once you understand what your needs are and where you might need to try to get more housing in your community, these would be mechanisms to do so. So a type of regulation, an incentive, a program, etc. And these strategies would ideally be wrapped into what we call a housing action plan, which is an implementation plan for identified strategies that would include what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and by whom, ideally. And then finally, the housing spectrum, which is what I had just showed you, which is an illustration that really depicts what may be ideal for most communities, the availability of housing that's affordable to households at all income levels and allows for changing life circumstances. So where does a housing needs assessment kind of fit in your entire housing picture of what you're going to do? In essence, a housing needs assessment, as you see is here, it helps you tell the story. Okay, we know by listening to the community that we have a housing problem. We know that employers have been screaming that they can't fill their jobs, etc. So the next step is to then do a needs assessment to figure out, okay, where really are the gaps and where are the mismatches in the market? How much and what type of housing is needed for whom and what prices? By telling the story and giving you the data, it can help you build support for programs in your community. It can help you educate the community as to the importance. You know, we can't fill our jobs. This business can't stay open because they can't get employees. And the reason for that is because their employees can't find housing, for example, how it impacts the community. And then provide information to the community as well to again build the support. It can also be used to help attract and acquire funding, state and federal funding resources, and also to potentially attract, develop development and developer interest in your community. Once you have the story and basically the picture of what's needed, that's where you move into these next steps of being able to prioritize actions and figure out what you need in your community, where your resources are at, and therefore what you can start doing about it in a targeted manner. So the typical contents of a housing needs assessment basically looks at demographics of your community, trends, are you losing families, are they staying, etc. Your economy, how well it's doing, trends, again, is it growing, is it shrinking? But in light of this too, preferably speaking also to employers about their struggles with finding employees, retaining employees, and also commute patterns. Taking a look, obviously, at your housing inventory, not just how much housing costs, but also what types of units. Do you have a mix of single family and attached in your community, a variety of housing types, or just one type? Is it old? Is it in poor condition? That kind of thing. Looking at your housing markets in terms of price points and availability for both ownership and rental. We know that with COVID, that the rental market, there's pretty much no rentals left in most of these communities. And also the housing market has gone insane for ownership, where there's drastically decreased inventory there as well. All those factors you need to take a look at. These last two are things that, particularly for communities that are a little more advanced and perhaps have been trying to address housing issues for some time, can in particular get a lot of value out of a section on the development environment, cost of development, what sort of regulations you might have in place that might be impeding, how you might be able to open up more opportunities, as well as potential land and that kind of thing. And then the final one would be resources and opportunities. So what sort of nonprofits do you have in your community? What sort of financing do you have available? Do you have partnerships available? Looking at what your community can currently bring to the table to try to start moving forward on these issues. And so the ultimate goal, by pulling all of this information together, is then to help you define how much housing do we need, at what price point, and for whom: ownership, rental, families, etc. And so in listing these needs the housing needs looking forward, we typically define this as two things. There's this current deficit or the catch-up need. This typically looks at things like unfilled jobs, the shortages in the rental or for sale market. Do you have wait lists for your properties? That kind of thing. Overcrowding in units. All things that go to showing that you currently have a deficit in housing and you're not able to house enough people today that your community really needs to be functioning to its capacity. The other component of housing needs is this keep up or future need. Typically, this looks at things like job growth. It might look at retiring employees. In a lot of these mountain communities where we work, for example, retiring employees with the aging workforce actually ends up creating more of a need in the future than some of the job growth figures, which is quite interesting. Through that, you can identify, okay, over the next 5 years, we see that we need, this many housing units. And needs assessment should also identify at which price points you might be looking at, which is really what this is showing. Where your rentals, where your market is providing rentals would be here. Where your market is under providing rentals in this area, depending again on matching where your inventory is and where your employees need and what's being built. It would also look, hopefully, at distribution of those units. This graphic here is really just showing in a community the percentage of owners that are earning at each AMI level, how many housing units, this is obviously a different community, how many housing units would be needed over the next 5 years in ownership. And this helps you identify how those should be distributed to best serve your community. So as you can see, of these 2,200 units, over 50% need to be priced in this blue area, which the market is currently under providing. And so basically, once you get your needs assessment and you have your story, how do you use this going forward? So the housing needs assessment can help you establish a common vision by which you can set goals, coordinate efforts, and monitor progress. As I said before, it helps you tell the story and helps you inform and educate the community and others about the need and the gaps of housing in your community. It can help you target capacity and resources by knowing what income levels you need to serve, by whether you need ownership or rental, and in what volumes. You can start looking at where are resources today, what can we start doing today, and how can we build up over time to do more. And it grounds your programs in the reality of needs. So instead of just saying, well, we have a housing problem, let's just do this, it lets you actually say, okay, wait, we have a housing problem, people can't get into entry-level ownership. If we provide this amount in down payment assistance, we know we can get this many people in, we know it will accommodate this much of our need, that kind of thing. And so that in essence is what kind of the goal of a housing needs assessment is and how you would use it. I wanted to spend some time in this discussion to hit on a couple of other things to make it perhaps a little more interesting as well. So one is, how can you, at the needs assessment process, set yourself up for success? Everyone always thinks, oh, needs assessment, okay, it's just data. You know, as soon as we have the information, then we can start really hitting the ground and trying to figure out, you know, how we can be successful and make things happen. You can really set yourself up for success at the needs assessment stage by making sure that it's targeting the right information and that it's presenting the information in a way that's going to be useful for your community on the back end. And so I want to use this section to talk about that and how you can avoid common pitfalls. But before I start with that, I think there's a question we were going to pose in the chat, which is for you guys, what is the primary challenge that your community has in addressing the housing issues in your area? And so I think what we're going to do is take a look at some of these when we get toward the end of the presentation and can review some of them as we move forward. So just to move forward, I want to start with kind of avoiding pitfall number one. I think, as you all know, when you have the discussion in your community about affordable housing, workforce housing, community housing, whatever you want to call it, different words have different connotations. And in some communities, words resonate, whereas in others, they create the opposite effect. So, for example, one thing that we typically do at the beginning of a needs assessment is say, okay, what do you want to call housing that residents and local workers can afford to live in your community moving forward? A lot of communities have moved away from the term affordable housing. You may be one of them, because it might carry connotations where people think of public housing projects in Chicago from like the 1960s. Even though affordable housing, the definition is much more generic than that. So this is something to think about when you're framing the housing needs assessment. How do we want to carry the message forward to our community? And how is the story best going to resonate and be told with our community as we take this forward? The second thing is that data matters. Where it comes from and how it's used and how it's presented. If you are a large community versus, say, a small community of 2,000 households, the availability and the accuracy of secondary data sources is really going to vary for your area. And the ability to really use existing data to tell your story is going to vary by community. You know, we get the question a lot, you know, well, we're only, 3,000 people, shouldn't the needs assessment only cost $5,000 because we don't have that many people in this community? Unfortunately, the smaller the community gets, the harder it is to get good data on that community. The Census ACS data, American Community Survey tends to get much less accurate as you go down in size. And the smaller communities, you really need to know what's going on the ground. You really need to focus some time on this primary research component with interviews, surveys of the community, et cetera, to understand the nuances. All of this, regardless of your size, obviously holds true. But basically, a needs assessment should take a look at what we call 3 points of reference. It should look at secondary or available data. It should look at local data through assessor, building departments, that kind of thing, on the ground info. And it should also do primary research in terms of the interviews and surveys, because it's really the intersection of all three of these sources that tell your story. If you're missing this primary research component and are only relying on data, you're going to be really missing the true story as to what's going on. A good example of this was when we did a project in Big Sky. The data itself showed that families were growing as a part of the demographic in that community. But then when we were talking to employers, they said that families were the first ones to move away because they couldn't afford to live in housing anymore. So they were losing a lot of their young family employees as a result. And then in talking with the school district, the enrollments were actually going up with children. It wasn't until we dove deeper with the school district and learned that the enrollments were going up because second homeowners were moving in with their families, but the local families that had grown up there were moving out. So they were basically, it was this shift and transition. So that's an example where if you only looked at secondary data or available data of the rising family trend, you would really miss this nuance that, well, yeah, no, they're not really retaining their local families. They're bringing them in from elsewhere. So pitfall number 3 is really to know your community. So before you ask for a needs assessment, know what stage in the process you're at. Are you a place where there's a housing problem, but when it really comes down to it, you just don't think there's just not the political will or the community support there to really move forward at this stage, then I would say really all you need the needs assessment for at this point would be for information. To take the information, chew on it, digest it, and figure out, okay, is this really something that we need to push forward further on? You know, if you're a community where you have been doing this for a while, you have programs in place, you have expertise and capacity, ability to take on programs, then you're probably going to need something more in depth. You know, you're not only going to need to know what your needs are, but you're probably also going to want to know how well is the stuff that we're doing performing. So you might need a little bit more in your study and covering some more components. It's just important to keep the scale in mind because obviously the more you add in, the higher the cost goes as well. Number 4, involvement matters. So at the needs assessment stage, it is really important to get all of the potential partners that you think would be or should be involved in helping you address your housing issue after the data comes out. You can really use the needs assessment process to get jurisdictions, organizations, nonprofits, employers, community members, other stakeholders talking at this stage and working together to help identify the problem. Because if everyone understands the problem from the data gathering stage and how you got to where your need is now, then it's going to be that much easier to move forward. Plus, the relationships you start building at this stage are going to help you a lot when you move to the implementation stage on the back end to try to figure out what you're going to do about it. And so with those components, the next thing I basically wanted to cover was what not to expect from a needs assessment. And these really come from a lot of common things that we see in pretty much 80% of the requests for proposals that we see for these studies over the years. Things and or through interviews, things that really result in over-asks or expectations of what this study itself can do for the community. While it can help the community get on track with housing, it doesn't do everything. So I just want to go through a few of these. So I'll call these myths. Myth number 1, the housing needs assessment itself will build housing. The housing needs assessment is not intended to build housing. However, it should provide you the information to eventually get housing built. Provides you the information to help build public support, to attract developer investment or interest, to compete for public monies, grants, or programs, to understand your opportunities, capacity, and limitations, and to prioritize what to do first. So while a needs assessment itself won't directly result in a development project, the information it provides can help you get there. Myth number 2, a housing needs assessment will tell us exactly what to build. Number of bedrooms that we need over the next 5 years, the size of the units, you know, between 1,000 square feet up to 1,500 square feet, etc. This is a lot of detail. Basically, housing markets and exactly how many bedrooms you're going to need is a moving target. Asking for this level of detail is basically not necessary. There's a time for it, which is called the market study period, which is when you have a specific site with a specific project in mind. This isn't to say that a housing needs assessment can't give you an idea of, oh, well, we don't have enough large units for larger families. It can definitely give you that idea. I'm talking about when you ask specifically for, we need 125 3-bedroom units over the next 5 years to address this group. That is getting really specific. To refresh, a housing needs assessment really focuses on the entire bridge, the entire income ranges and what's needed in your community. A housing market study is what would then come in. So after you've done this and you say, okay, we need housing here, let's look at a specific project. That's where a housing market study would come in. And it focuses on a specific project within one piece of the bridge on an identified piece of property. You don't want to put families, for example, on a piece of property that's right next to a busy highway. Ideally not. So the market study will take a look at the location, it will take a look at what's suitable in terms of housing there, and then it will take a look at the exact bedroom mix that you need to reach that target population. So myth number 3, a housing needs assessment will tell us what we need over the next 20 years. This is a really common ask in housing needs assessments. Tell us what we need for 20 years. The problem that we run into with this is, one, we don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I would probably be retired a long time ago and be very wealthy at this point. But for example, COVID, we finished a housing study literally 2 weeks before COVID shut everything down. Did we anticipate that to happen? No. Our projections only went for 5 years, and 1 month after it was done, COVID hit, so things happen in markets. Markets are ever changing. You have to track markets regularly. By thinking you're going to get something that's going to tell you what to do for the next 20 years and you can just leave it alone, that is also creating a false sense of reality. Housing is hard. You have to monitor progress and change your programs as needed. Typically, check-ins at a minimum every 5 years are needed just to make sure everything's still on track, that your needs really haven't shifted, there haven't been any big economic changes. Ideally, if you have a lot of programs in place, you're going to be monitoring them on a regular basis, at least yearly, just to make sure everything is moving along as you expected. Again, this is to not just think about this, that you don't want to pay for what you don't need or what won't be helpful. Number 4, we will learn the one thing that is going to solve our problem. This is really common. In essence, there is no silver bullet. Every successful housing program has multiple programs in place. There's not one program, or for that matter, one entity that can do it all. In essence, it really takes a community to help build and retain a community. Thinking back to that slide about bringing in the engagement of all those partners at the housing needs assessment stage, those are really all the partners you're going to need to be really effective to address housing in your community. Not necessarily, even if they aren't building the housing themselves, at least having them to support your efforts moving forward will make it a lot easier. And then finally, the problem is never solved. It's always evolving. You can help the problem, but it's never going to completely go away. So this is an example of a housing action plan that was identified around the housing spectrum. And as you see here, this community had about 12 to 15 different actions that they were looking at to address the variety of housing needs that they need in their community. And they mapped them on the housing bridge to say, okay, employer provided seasonal housing. Well, we know that's going to hit over here. Let's make sure we have some programs that are going to be hitting up here too, because we need housing here as well. And so this is really something that can help you see where, if you only have capacity to do 1 or 2 programs today, that's fine, but then build on it over time to complete your spectrum for your community. So myth number 5, we need to know the kitchen sink. We have to know everything and every detail about our community. Or the converse is, we know we have a housing problem. We don't need any data. We just need to do something about it. So to the first one with the kitchen sink, again, that gets to not overpaying for things that you don't need. It also gets to expectations and what makes sense. So for example, a lot of housing needs assessment asks for specific recommendations on every single component of their housing needs. So they might say, okay, we want you to tell us how many homeless units and what types those are going to be for the next 5 years. We also want to know exactly how many senior assisted living units we're going to need. We also want to know exactly how many 30% AMI rental units we're going to need for people on welfare, for example, etc. The housing needs assessment, as defined in here, is general. It's going to give you a picture of all of those components and what you might need. As far as specific detail on all of those, a lot of those need specific special needs studies in and of themselves. I know consultants that focus solely on senior housing and senior housing needs for communities. In other words, throwing in the kitchen sink is going to make the budget grow. It's going to make the system grow. And so focus on what it is you really need to know about in your study and your ask. The converse, and an example here is actually where I am. We did a study for South Lake Tahoe. They had probably about 15 different community partners that really wanted to do something with housing. And they were all over the map. They were trying to get things done, but because they didn't have a study done, they didn't know where to focus their resources. And they spent at least 2 years going around in circles and never actually achieving anything, because once they would start to apply resources in one direction, they would see that a need was over here, so they'd shift gears. And so nothing ever got done. Even though you have a housing problem, you need to know where to focus and what your vision is for the community. Otherwise, you're just going to be going in circles. So that concludes, I guess, everything I had to say. And so I think through the chat, we're going to open it up for more questions and reactions from the group.
Thank you, Wendy. Again, we appreciate that wisdom, and there were a lot of great comments in the chat about how useful that information is. So we'll take the remaining 12 minutes and maybe just dig deeper into some things that came up for folks. And first, I want to ask a question I had, which I think cuts across some of the questions that were put in the question and answer. And for everybody else on the call, again, a reminder to please submit any questions you have for Wendy via the Q&A function. So Wendy, my first question for you is that many NAR communities have very limited staff and resources, as I'm sure you know all too well. What is your advice for places that really don't have easy access to people or funding to really hire a consultant or to have somebody on their staff do a housing assessment? Where do they start? What can they do?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Well, you start, I guess I would say, one, if you can't hire any outside assistance, I would say start within your community. Start the conversations with the employers, start the conversations with others in your community, because the more that you can build support from community members and open eyes to, none of us can do this alone, but maybe if we pair together, we can actually start making a dent. And that's really what, the slide that I had in the housing needs assessment, pulling together those partners in a room to start the conversation. especially for communities that have very limited resources and limited capacity, that is really important because you're going to need to borrow on everyone to get anything done. So I would say, really start there, and then hopefully through that, you'll be able to build enough of a coalition to, get someone in to do a quick resource study for you, like that first bridge that I saw. You could do a quick study that just shows generally what you need without having to do, a $60,000
Mm-hmm.
research project.
Right. I'm actually just going to build on that, Wendy, and ask if you think there's value in approaching the housing question at more of a regional scale, and that maybe some of those partners are, not one community and the local partners, but at counties and other communities in your region. Have you seen any regional studies? Do you think that'd be helpful?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yes, yes, no, definitely. Actually, I would say since I've been doing this work, regional studies have become a little more the norm than they
Mm.
have been in the past. Yeah, we did, we've done about 4 or 5 regional studies, multi-county. The one here in Tahoe was multi-state, multi-county. But yes, I mean, I think everyone recognizes, or a lot recognize, that housing is a regional problem, and you can only do so much locally, and so it really makes sense to work together as a region to address the issue.
I appreciate that perspective. It's part of why we named our initiative the Gateway Natural Amenity Region Initiative. Is our research and observation suggests a lot of these problems are very regional, and the solutions need to be regional. So it's interesting to hear your perspective on that, Wendy. And I'm seeing some notes about that in the chat as well. I also am seeing in the chat that one community is saying they hosted an AmeriCorps Vista member to assist with housing needs assessment. And I know we've gotten Vistas into some of the GNAR communities. We've worked to try and help with some of these planning issues. So just an interesting idea of resources and tools that are out there. And I would encourage everybody on the call, if you have other ideas of resources or things your community has done, share that via the chat. Maybe consider writing a blog about it. We really want everyone to share their wisdom with each other. Wendy, a question from the chat is about ownership versus rental ratio. And the question is, do you typically strive to carry forward the existing ratio? Is there a trend towards more rentals in the communities you're working in? Thoughts about that ratio of ownership and rental?
It depends. Really depends on the community. I would say recently, the recent work we've been doing, more of the focus, well, I guess I can't say more. In identifying needs over a 5-year time span, I would say a larger percentage of it seems to be toward the rental side. But in a sense, that makes sense. Usually when people first come to a community, they need a rental to get in the community before they can really figure out that they want to be in that community and purchase a home. But I would say in the near term, on the short side, there's definitely been projects where the first thing out of the gate is an affordable ownership product. For the reason that they had been struggling. Yes, they're struggling with both, but they had the resources, they had the land, and they had the capacity to push momentum forward on this project, which, was a community that, was struggling with ownership, especially for the missing middle as well. So I would say it's hard because it really depends on your community and where you're at.
There's a question that just came in via the chat. I think it's actually a really relevant one. Do you know of any resources that provide diagnostic tools for helping to interpret what people see in the data, right? It's one thing to get the data, but then making sense of it's a whole other question. Do you have any thoughts for what communities can lean on to help them make sense of it once they get some data in?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Usually that's me. That's why it's hard to answer. I would say, because there are products out there like through the census and on the map, but that's a tough one, because it really takes experience working with the data and the information to know the weaknesses of the data set, the different things that you're looking at, what it is that you need to understand from each resource to get you there. So, universities, students might be a resource. But I would say, ideally, like I said, that's tough because that's kind of what I'm hired for.
Yeah. Well, that's what professionals, right? Yeah,
I
yeah. And that makes me think that maybe there's a way the Nar Initiative can actually try to work with some
yeah.
of the professionals and create some generalizable things and just connect communities to those professionals who really are experts in this, right? And there's a reason you have expertise, and we're so thankful you're sharing it with us today. There's a question about data, and maybe I'm thinking this could be relevant for some people who aren't as familiar with acronyms and certain kinds of data. So the question is, what is MLS data? And then what kinds of data can planning departments actually share on housing? What kind of information do they tend to have on kinds of units, et cetera?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so MLS is multiple listing service. It's basically what realtors have access to with the housing sales data and information. The planning department, so planning departments have access to assessor records. Assessor records vary by community. Some are very well kept up and have awesome information, and others, not so much. So it's kind of dependent on the community how useful it is. But that basically gives you parcel by parcel data and development data of, whether it's a residence, what size it is, how old it is, that kind of thing, so that you can get some pretty detailed data through that. Assessors usually also track sales and sale values of homes. And so that's another way to get at that information. Planning departments also know building activity, building permits. They also know, they deal with developers. So they tend to know what's working and what's not as well, as far as that goes. So I don't know if there's more.
Well, I encourage people who are interested, maybe talk to your department and see what kind of information they have
Mhm,
or how you can partner with them to get more information.
mhm.
So we're short on time. I think I'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up, and we'll migrate anybody who wants to stay on and actually talk to each other to a meeting platform, so you can do that. So the last question I'm going to take is just about in-housing assessments. How do you determine what people are willing to settle with to live in the places we live in, which tend to be very desirable places? In other words, many families of four desire three-bedroom single family residence, but they may be willing to live in a two-bedroom condo so they can be part of the community. How do you qualify that? How do you understand that? How do you think about that?
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a great question and spot on, because we typically see that a lot in these communities. People are willing, they're willing to be in the place and give a trade-off to do it. Quite honestly, the best information we get on that is by doing a direct household survey and asking. And we recognize that adds expense to the process, but that's the best way to hear it from the people themselves of the kind of trade-offs they're going to make. Other examples that you might look at is just look at products that have been built in your community and how well they've been received and what their occupancy is. That can give you a sense of uh, of what people are willing to trade to get into.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. We do have a NAR initiative toolkit online, and we're starting increasingly to post more and more information on housing. So I want to encourage people to go there. And I'm going to ask Liz or Jake who are on the call to put a link to that in the chat if they can. So we've got some tools and resources, and we're going to continue to compile them. And if you and your community have tools and resources, things that have been helpful to you, please let us know. We'll share those via our toolkit. We'd love to have you share them via blog. We can write a blog on them. So again, help us help you is sort of the theme of the NAR initiative. There were some questions in our Q&A we were not able to answer today, so we will try to see if we can get some answers to those, maybe include that in the summary. Not promising, but we will try. And I just want to remind everybody, especially those of you who might have joined us late, that this webinar was recorded. The recording will be shared via the NAR Initiative website, as will the slides from the presentation. And here in a moment, we're going to migrate over anybody who wants to stay on and actually talk to other people in communities like yours to a meeting platform, so we can put you into breakout groups and you can really interact in a way that we really can't do here on a webinar. Before I do so, I just want to remind everybody on the webinar that our next webinar is on May 4th from 2 o'clock to 3:30 on short-term rental trends in the Intermountain West and how to craft an ordinance to handle them. I think short-term rentals are very much at play in our housing challenges, so I hope folks will join for that. A reminder that you can register for that webinar and find out more information on our website. So I'm going to put that into the chat, so a link there. All right, so we are going to move over, all of us who want to a meeting platform. I'm going to put the link for the next Zoom call, the meeting where we can actually interact with each other in the chat, encourage anybody who wants to stay on and talk with each other to head over there. That way we can see each other, we can be in breakout rooms together. So that link is in the chat. Please head over there. We're going to wrap this one up. I will be on that other link in a moment. And thanks to everybody who's participated today, especially to you, Wendy. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. So with
Yeah.
that, again, hopefully folks will hop over onto the other call. And thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.